Hello, everyone. This is Nathan Ritz with the Greater Des Moines Partnership. I serve as Regional Workforce Development and Education Director here. I'll be helping to moderate the questions and answers that you'll be getting today during our LGBT 101 session. So I don't want to delay too much, but just to give an overview that this session will inform our participants of the concepts of underlying LGBT identities such as biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Common forms of discrimination will be illuminated, as well as the situation around local, state, and federal non-discrimination laws. Tools and strategies for creating safe and welcoming space will also be discussed. We do have a wonderful facilitator with us today. I believe it's his second time working with us, so we're happy to have him back. His name is Keenan Crow. He is the Deputy Director of One Iowa, the state's leading LGBT organization, which works towards full equality for LGBT individuals in Iowa through grassroots efforts in education. He joined the organization after a history of political and nonprofit work with organizations such as Cedar Valley Citizens for Undoing Racism and Planned Parenthood of the Heartland. Keenan has worked to train a diverse number of organizations and institutions around LGBT issues, including K-12 educators, local and federal agencies, businesses, healthcare providers, and law enforcement facilities. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get going. Your phone lines are muted, but you can chat with us. So if at any time you do have a question, you have the option to raise your hand and I'll chat with you, or you can send me a message. Again, I'm actually using my colleague's login, so it'll show up in the system as Meg, but my name is actually Nathan. So feel free to send me a message on here and we'll get your questions answered as they arise, or I may ask you if we can hold it until the end or at another point in the presentation. Without any further delays, I'm going to hand it over to Keenan.
Cool. Yeah, as he said, my name is Keenan Crow. I'm the Deputy Director at One Iowa, and today we're going to be talking about the LGBT community and what those terms even mean for the beginning, and some associated concepts with that as well. So can I get the next slide? Cool. So what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to understand the distinction between gender and sex. These are two words that we use relatively interchangeably, but their distinct definitions are going to be important, moving especially towards the back half of the presentation when we start talking about the legal aspects around this community, because those words are defined differently legally very often. We're also going to look at some of the unique challenges faced by LGBT individuals, their friends, their families, co-workers, etc. We'll look at some of the relevant federal and local laws around this community and answer any questions you have there. And then we'll look at a couple quick strategies for creating safe, inclusive spaces in the workplace or wherever you may need that to be. I will say I understand that anytime I give one of these presentations that there are a number of different viewpoints on the LGBT community, whether they come from political differences or from religious communities or cultural understandings or whatever that may be. And I'm hoping that those won't matter too much today. We're not asking you to, march in the Gay Pride Parade after attending this webinar or anything like that. What we're really looking to do is to give you a better understanding of the community, help you understand that community work, and treat these folks with the respect and dignity that anybody else deserves as well. So also feel free to ask any question in any way that you understand how. I know, especially at the beginning of this presentation, before we've talked about language, that folks may have some reservations asking questions. They don't know the right language to use, et cetera, et cetera. I would rather have you just ask the question in whatever way that you understand how to ask the question, and any language issues we can tackle during the answer and all that good stuff. So please feel free to ask any question in any way that you understand how, because there's probably somebody else on the line that has the exact same question as you, and that's how we learn. So
on that note as well, when you do ask me a question, I won't shout out that Nathan of the Greater Des Moines Partnership asked this question. So feel free that if you do have some anonymity there as well. So
that's even better, actually. Great. Let's go to the next slide. So for those of you who were wondering about One Iowa, One Iowa is the state's largest LGBT advocacy organization. We work towards full equality for LGBT Iowans through grassroots efforts in education, as we had said before. A lot of people view us as the marriage organization. We started out that way in 2005 as a marriage equality organization. Obviously, we've had marriage in Iowa since 2009, so quite some time now. Had full federal benefits since June 26th of 2013. In fact, my birthday was June 25th of 2013. DOMA fell on June 26th of 2013, and I signed my contract on June 27th of 2013, knowing full well that we would be pivoting away from marriage and looking at a more cradle-to-the-grave approach to equality, trying to tackle some of the other issues that have kind of gotten maybe thrown into the shadow because of the marriage equality debate. Marriage equality is kind of one of the top things on everybody's mind when you hear about the LGBT community. It is certainly an important issue. It's a necessary condition for equality, but it's not a sufficient condition for equality, and so we're working on that second part there. So go ahead and hit the button again, and we'll bring up a little graphic. Cool. So these are some of our programs. Iowa Pride Network is our youth organization, works on organizing GSAs, that's gay straight alliances, in middle schools, high schools, and colleges. These are kind of support networks for young folks who may or may not have any other support systems in their communities. Gay and Grey in the Midwest looks at the aging and elder LGBT community. Folks are trending towards going back into the closet when they enter long-term care facilities just because they don't know what the situation's going to be there. They want to remain safe, etc. Our health work addresses health disparities and particularly looks at those in the transgender community and how to rectify that. Transforming corrections culture primarily works in correctional institutions. We train about 2,000 law enforcement officers a year, primarily jail and jail staff folks that are around those issues. And then we also do some work around the federal court system, and then we have a podcast called Flyover Radio for those of you who are interested in podcasts. So hit that again. I guess there's a weird animation glitch there. Okay, so you don't have to be an expert on the LGBT community to be culturally competent. I hear that all too often. Oh, God, what if I make a mistake? What if I say the wrong thing? You're going to make a mistake. You're going to say the wrong thing. There's going to be no way around that. Anytime you're engaging a new culture, a new community, you're going to make some mistakes. You have to give yourself the space to make those mistakes. The important thing is not that you're not making mistakes. The important thing is that you're learning from those mistakes. It's incredibly apparent, the folks who are trying to do the right thing and are genuinely making a mistake, and the folks who are not trying to do the right thing and are intentionally trying to be hurtful to people. And I think most folks are going to recognize that difference. So you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to have, a master's degree in queer theory or anything to treat LGBT people with dignity and respect. You really just need some basic information, which you're going to be getting today, a willingness to learn, which I assume you have because you're on this particular webinar, and the ability to listen openly to what someone is trying to tell you. And that last part is particularly important and ongoing in any given situation. So terminology, we're going to be covering all of these different terms that you see listed here. The one that I'm not going to go into a ton of depth on is that bottom one that you see called cisgender. And you can kind of think of cisgender as an opposite term to transgender. So if you're not a transgender person, you're a cisgender person. So if you're like myself, I was assigned male at birth, I identify as a man, that makes me cisgender. So if you hear that term, just think of it as not transgender. I think that's the easiest way to kind of think of that. Great. So let's start with sexual orientation. I think this is maybe a little bit easier for folks to understand than the gender identity thing, and so I like to start here. Sexual orientation is the enduring pattern of romantic or sexual attraction to persons of the same sex or gender, the opposite sex or gender, or to both sexes, or more than one gender, depending on how those folks are defining that. And it is kind of something that we can't really show other people. It's that deep-seated feeling of attraction that we have toward other folks. As many of you, I'm sure, well know, you can't choose who you have a crush on. And that is kind of what I'm talking about here, are those feelings of attraction toward other folks that we don't get to choose, that are just kind of given to us in one way or another. And I like to kind of tier this up into three different levels when I'm talking about sexuality. And that base level is going to be sexual orientation. And these are those feelings of attraction that we can't change. They are internal to us. We can't really show other people what our sexual orientation is. We can certainly tell them, but I'll get to that tier here in a moment. So that base tier, sexual orientation, and then the next tier up is going to be sexual behavior. And so we can behave either in accordance with our sexual orientation, we can not behave at all, or we can behave in opposition to our sexual orientation as well. There's nothing that says that you have to behave in a certain way. And then the top tier is identity, how we tell other people what our sexual orientation is. Now, these three things may or may not match all of each other. So the sexual orientation and the behavior and the identity component may be all misaligned. And normally when they're misaligned, we call that person closeted. Oh, we have a problem.
I think we may be having a problem. It looks like the webinar may have ended.
Uh-oh.
Awesome. Oh, yeah. It did.
Huh.
It ended our webinar.
Well, that's silly.
It says it's in session, though.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For those of you on the line, hopefully, there we go. Okay, a couple, they can hear our audio, it's still working.
Good.
Sorry, it closed on our end completely. So it looks like we're still good here. Just need to share the PowerPoint with you again. There we go. It looks like we're good.
Cool.
Sorry about that, guys.
All right. So as I had said, I don't know when we cut off. So I'll start from the beginning of that thought.
We're good.
Cool. So, 3 tiers: sexual orientation is the base tier, then behavior, then identity, and how we actually tell other people what our orientation is. And if those 3 things are not aligned, normally we call that person closeted. And if they are aligned, normally that person is a bit psychologically healthier. If our behavior and our orientation and our identity are all nice and neat, then we don't have to worry about who is finding out what or anything like that. And it tends to have better outcomes. So let's go to the next slide.
Come on.
I don't think we're actually in PowerPoint. I think you're in the viewer.
There we go.
Cool. All right, so a couple of different sexual orientations. The one that we're probably the most familiar with, the one that is associated with the majority of the population, is straight. And that's the identity level for somebody who is attracted to members of the opposite sex. Lesbian, typically a label for women who who partner with other women. Gay, normally a label for men who partner with other men, although some women may use that label as well. Bisexual, normally a label for folks who partner with either men or women or somebody else on some other part of the gender spectrum. However, that particular person defines that is kind of up to them, and I would definitely inquire with a label like bisexual, because a lot of people have a lot of different definitions on that. So definitely ask those questions. Next slide.
My viewer has disappeared again.
Uh-oh.
So I just want to make sure that we're on top here. There
Cool.
it is.
Yep.
Sexual orientation.
Oh.
Let's see, this is where we're...
Does that mean that we
cannot
can't
see the slides? PowerPoint
Crap.
is not changing. Give us 1 second here. Again,
right.
I'm going to close this document. No, I don't want to screen. Okay. I am the presenter.
Shut my screen.
Show my PowerPoint.
Yay.
Sorry, everyone. Not sure what happened.
Is it working now?
It should say the slide should say, according to American Psychological Association. If you're seeing that, could you raise your hand or? Yes, we're good.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you, thank you,
Hooray.
thank you. Thank you for sticking with us.
Wonderful.
We're going to get through this.
So, the American Psychological Association. For those of you who are not familiar with the American Psychological Association, they are the largest body of mental health professionals in the world at the moment. If you go to a psychiatrist and you get diagnosed with a mental disorder of some sort, the folks, or the way that they make that diagnosis is by using a set of criteria, and that set of criteria is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. It's now in its 5th edition, which means you're going to see it abbreviated as DSM-5. And so the folks that actually put together the DSM-5 are the American Psychological Association. So they really are the authority on what is and is not a mental illness. And what they tell us is that those different sexual orientations that we had seen on that previous slide are not a mental illness. They're not an emotional problem. They're not a disorder. They're not a paraphilia. They're not any of those things, that they are, in fact, a normal expected response in human sexual behaviors. Further, as I had said before, not a choice, not something that we can freely choose, and not something that other folks can choose for us either. There have been a number of attempts to do that, normally called conversion or reparative therapies. They can range in severity from something like just saying, hey, don't do that anymore, all the way up to very physically harrowing experiences, electroshock therapies, inducing of vomiting, needles in people's fingertips. Really, really horrible, horrible stuff. The important thing to realize about that is no matter how intense it is, no matter how long it lasts, you can electroshock somebody for 10 years straight, and they would not change their sexual orientation. Nothing we are aware of actually changes anybody's sexual orientation, and so doing that in order to change somebody's sexual orientation can be incredibly damaging, because all you're really doing is just torturing that person arbitrarily. You're not going to change their sexual orientation in any sort of meaningful way. There have been a number of lawsuits that have come up around this, probably the most high profile being the one in New Jersey a few months back, which outlawed this on the basis of consumer fraud, that they were essentially trying to deliver a service that they couldn't possibly deliver, and indeed all the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. That said, it is still legal in the majority of the states in this country. 47 states still legal practice, including in the state of Iowa. Determined by a number of different factors, usually at a very early age. Sexual orientation we find deep set by about age 10 or so. Gender identity normally by about age 3 or 4, which I think is a little bit earlier than a lot of folks may recognize. But if you ask a 3 or 4-year-old whether they're a boy or a girl, they can often tell you with absolute clarity whether they are a boy or a girl, and indeed many trans kids can as well. And as I had said before, it is different from sexual behavior and different from how we identify ourselves. So always keep those 3 tiers in mind and recognize that they don't necessarily have to link up. Next slide. Cool. So sex versus gender. As I said before, this is going to be important to the back half of the presentation. So really internalize this. Biological sex refers to kind of the hormones, the chromosomes, genital and reproductive anatomy. It's a scientific classification based on reproductive capacity, which organism can reproduce with which other organism. And any organism that reproduces sexually gets a biological sex. We assign that to anything that reproduces sexually across the board based on their reproductive role. Gender, on the other hand, is something that we only apply to human beings. So your dog doesn't have gender, your cat doesn't have gender. It's a socially constructed system, partially, and it's partially how we view ourselves in terms of those social categories. And so those things may not be the same for any particular individual. So a person with male anatomy may dress, speak, behave in a feminine manner, may still identify as a man when they're doing so. It really just depends on that individual. Gender identity. Gender identity is kind of the persistent internal sense that we have of being a man or a woman or neither of those things, depending on the person. We all have a gender identity. I think too often we get into this pattern of thinking that only LGBT people have a sexual orientation or a gender identity, but we all have both of those things. Straight cis people have both a sexual orientation and a gender identity as well. And for most of us, that matches the sex that we were assigned at birth, but for transgender people, it doesn't. That's really the only difference between a transgender person and a cisgender person, is that that gender identity is not a good match for the sex we were assigned at birth. Our gender identity may or may not match our appearance, may not match our body or others' perceptions of us. Once again, we're in kind of a tiered system, and this is our base tier around gender, is that gender identity system. It's internal to our psyche. It's between our ears. It's not something that we can show other people. What we can show other people are our gender expressions, and those are kind of the mannerisms, the personal traits, the ways of dressing. How long is our hair, and in what style is it cut? Are we wearing makeup? Are we wearing nail polish? Are our shoes closed-toed or open-toed? Do they have heels on the back of them? How do we sit? How do we speak? How do we walk? All of these things actually serve to communicate our gender to other folks within our society. They often have nothing to do with our biological sex. Now, there are some that are obviously linked a little bit, not causally linked, but they tend to be linked. So things like muscle mass, amount of facial hair, all those things are slightly linked to biological sex. However, most of the things that we identify as gender markers in our society are not biologically linked, and these are things like boys wear blue, girls wear pink. Those colors were completely flip-flopped 150 years ago. Different cultures have different colors. Some cultures don't gender color at all. They will assign colors to things like age rather than gender. Most of the things that we think about, all those things that I listed earlier, you know, the hairstyles, the shoes choices, how people sit, all those things are cultural decisions that we have made that have changed over time, that will continue to change and probably will not be the same 100 years from now either. And two people with the same gender identity may have different expressions of that identity, and those may not match others' expectations. For those of you who have seen a bit of the longer presentation, I will occasionally go into this thing about George W. and have some graphics there to show you what the different George W's look like, and the joke is always, the crutch of the joke is always that George Washington is the first George W. that we get to talk about, and he looks very different than George W. Bush. These are two people that both identify as men, who both have the same job, the same name, et cetera, et cetera. We change one variable, the time period in which they exist, and you can see a dramatic change in their gender identity despite having all those other things the same. And it is highly culturally sensitive. It varies with both the geographical location where somebody is located, the time period in which they exist, their peer groups, their professional expectations, their political beliefs, their religious affiliations. All those things kind of tend to put parameters around what we see as quote-unquote acceptable ways to express our gender within our society. And go one slide further, actually. So transgender is an umbrella term. We like to think that if you look at that top left area-ish where it says male to female, female to male, a lot of people think that that's the only thing that transgender is, that it's people who were born male and are now living as women, or people who were born female and are now living as men. But it's that and more. It's pretty much any individual who crosses over or challenges society's traditional gender roles and or gender expressions. And it can look like a lot of different things. It can look like male to female or female to male transgender people, but it can also look like bigender people. It can look like third gender categories, which we have a number of legal third gender categories throughout the world. New Zealand has some, and as of 2 weeks ago, Oregon actually has a legal third gender category as well. Within our society and, kind of Western traditions, we normally think of two gender categories, man and woman. But in other societies, they have other gender categories. Some will have three gender categories. Some will have four. Some will have five. There's actually a map that you can find online, which will show you all these different cultures that have all these different gender categories. So, for instance, you'll see on there Two-Spirit, which is a Native American gender category, which encompasses both the masculine and feminine spirit simultaneously. We have in Southeast Asian traditions, the Hijra, which is fairly similar to Two-Spirit, but has some important differences, which I don't have time to go into at the moment, but if you're interested, please look those up. The other thing is that some people who may fit under this umbrella, so on the far left, masculine women, feminine men, androgynous persons, may or may not identify as transgender. There are plenty of masculine women out there in the world who don't identify as trans, but there are a sizable portion who also do. So this is a self-applied label. We don't get to apply this to other people. People may meet the criteria without actually identifying in that way. So transgender people, they can decide to transition at any age. As I had said before, a lot of folks know at a relatively early age that they are trans. They may not have the words for it. They may not know exactly what that means, but they know that something is amiss. But they may wait to transition until they're much, much older. And some of the primary reasons surrounding that are simply safety. So, for instance, about 5% of our youth in the United States are LGBT identified. About 40% of our homeless youth population in the United States is LGBT identified. It can be incredibly dangerous to come out as a young person to your family. You could lose not only your home, you could lose, your friends, your family, your church, access to your phone or to the family car, money for college. Anything that somebody could use to hold over you, they may, and so that becomes part of the calculation. After they're out of college, after they're out of school, whatever route they go, you can still be fired in 31 states for being trans, and 28 for being lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and so there's a calculation there. There are people going back into the closet when they're going into long-term care facilities as well. And so at every single stage of life, there are barriers erected to prevent people from transitioning, to prevent people from coming out of the closet, however you want to look at that. And there are a number of different reasons that people may wait until a much older age when they feel more secure to transition or to come out. Folks may or may not change their names. They may or may not change their pronouns. They may or may not use hormones. They may or may not have surgeries. I think there is another misunderstanding going on that most transgender people are going through what we would call a quote-unquote full medical transition, and that means having all the surgeries and taking hormones for the rest of their life. In fact, over 80% of transgender people will not go through what we would consider a full medical transition, and that can be, once again, for a number of reasons. Maybe they don't have the funding to do that. Most insurance providers do not cover that kind of procedure. We actually have a blanket ban under Iowa State Medicaid around these procedures, and so low-income folks often cannot access that kind of stuff. Even if they have the resources to access it, though, they may or may not want surgery. They may be just fine with how their body looks, even though they are living as a different gender. It really just depends on the person. For every single person, every trans person that you encounter, they're going to have different reasons of why or why not they would want or would not want surgeries. And so I think it's best not to focus on the hormone and surgery aspect. So what to do when you meet transgender people? Ask what they prefer to be called and use that name. I think that's patently straightforward. We do that with everybody else we meet. Just apply the same criteria to transgender people that you would apply to anybody else. So if you knew somebody's legal name was Robert and you went to a party and they introduced themselves as Bobby, would you cross your arms and stomp your feet and insist that you call them Robert because you know that's their legal name? No, you absolutely would not do that. You would just call them Bobby and you would move on with your life, and everybody would be happier for it. And I suggest the same thing with transgender people. If you know somebody's legal name is different than their preferred name, just use their preferred name. stop it. Unless you have an absolute legal standard that you have to use somebody's legal name in every context, and I know that there are people, working in facilities that have that standard, but most of us are not, and so we just use the names that people give us, and we leave it at that. And then the second thing, avoiding invasive, unnecessary questions. I know folks are super interested in things like surgeries and in hormones and all that good stuff. If you're interested in just how that happens, Google is your friend, and you can find all sorts of information out about surgeries on the internet. But when you ask somebody about their personal surgeries, what you're really doing is you're asking a complete stranger about their genitals. And politeness, we just don't do that. We don't ask strangers about their genitals. And so just don't ask people about their surgeries because it is incredibly impolite. Next slide. Cool. Intersex. Normally I would ask and see how many people actually know what the term intersex is, and normally I get about one hand in every room, and then I ask if anybody knows what the term hermaphrodite is, and then I get everybody else's hands. So hermaphrodite is the term that I learned in my kind of middle school science textbook about this community. And for a number of different reasons, primarily one just being that it's scientifically inaccurate, that hermaphroditism refers to a reproductive process that humans cannot engage in at all. And I won't describe exactly what that means, but the deal is that term is not accurate, and so it was changed, and now the correct term is intersex. And these are folks who may be born with either both sets of genitalia, neither set of genitalia, maybe external male genitalia, internal female reproductive systems, whatever that looks like. The important thing to recognize about this community is not all the specific different kinds of things that can go into creating such a condition, but that at a biological level, these folks are neither male nor female. They are some combination of the two, or neither, depending on the person. Can I do videos? Can I do a video on this? Will that work?
We could try.
Let's try it.
Is it linked in here? Or is it?
Yeah, just go to the next slide, and it should be in there. Do I have sound? Don't have sound.
We do not have sound.
Is it on the computer that we don't have sound? Can anybody else hear the sound?
They wouldn't, because it would be coming through here.
Okay. All right. We'll skip the video then. If anybody wants to see this video, it's very easy to find. Just search BuzzFeed Intersex on YouTube, and you can find this. It's for really intelligent intersex people talking about themselves, their lives, what it means to be intersex, how many people are intersex. It takes about 3 minutes. It's incredible. I've met all these folks. They're wonderful people. I highly recommend looking at that video, because I think it's very important to talk about this community. It's a community that really does not get discussed, even within the LGBT community at all, but I think it brings up some very interesting issues. So this is the genderbread person. This is kind of a funny little way to tie together the 4 concepts that we had been talking about up to this point. Is there any way that they can see my mouse, or is that not a thing?
There's a highlighter here. Oh, here's a spotlight. There we go.
Spotlight. Cool. So if I click on stuff, it's going to show them that, or
they see where your
they see where my spotlight is.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So we have gender identity, which, as I had said, is internal to our psyche. We have expression, which is how we show other people our gender in our society. We have our biological sex, which is our anatomical parts, and we have our orientation, which is kind of who we are attracted to. And you'll notice that unlike, our traditional model of being kind of one or the other, one box or a different box checking male or female on the form, that all of these things are on a scale or a spectrum, that there is no clear delineating line between any of these aspects. And so we probably all know people who are exclusively attracted to members of the same sex. Probably all know people who are attracted exclusively to members of the opposite sex. We may know somebody who is 50-50 attracted equally. We may know somebody who has a preference one way or the other. The important thing to recognize is that every single point along this line, somebody in the world exists. And we all exist on these points as well. So we can kind of plot ourselves on these too. So gender identity. We may, can I move this? Is that a thing I can do? I can want to. Okay, cool, that's fine. There are folks that identify as women, there are folks that identify as men, there are folks that identify as neither or both of those things simultaneously. There are people who present more masculinely, there are people who present more femininely, there are people like David Bowie who switch their appearance on a constant basis or try to remain as androgynous as possible. Biological sex, there are people who are born with typical female genitalia, people who are born with typical male genitalia, people who are born intersex and have some combination of both of those things. And this is a real gray area here too, because there is no clear delineating line between somebody who is born typically female or male or somebody who is born intersex. It's just, once again, a gradation. And as soon as it gets too combined between the two, then it begins to be considered intersex. But if you take a person and go to a medical professional, one person may say that they're intersex, one person may say that they're not intersex. It really just depends on how much of both of those biological aspects they have simultaneously. And everybody kind of has a map. So these are all separate from one another too. Just because you knew, for instance, somebody's gender identity, their biological sex, and their sexual orientation doesn't mean that you know their gender expression. Just because you know their gender identity, their gender expression, and their sexual orientation doesn't mean you know their biological sex. They are all 100% independent from one another. And they can all be mapped. So, for instance, myself, I was born male, and I can't quite get my highlighter all the way over to the far side of that. So if you see me kind of stumbling there, that's why. And I normally express relatively masculinely, and I identify as a man, although I actually would put myself right around here, kind of halfway between man and genderqueer, because I view gender as relatively performative. And I actually am heterosexual, so I date people of the opposite sex fairly primarily, or I would, consider myself heteroflexible, and I would put myself maybe right here. But I get rounded up to straight on a regular basis. So that's kind of what the gender-read person looks like. Try to think of what your map looks like. So my map, it goes from here to here to here to here. What does your map look like? Everybody in the world has a map on this, and everybody's map is maybe a little bit different from everybody else's. And try to think of how you look, and then recognize that everybody else has a slightly different one as well. Let's turn off that highlighter. Cool. And then let's go to the next slide. Cool. So let's remember that it's not always obvious who's LGBT. They're not like a shade of pink or purple or anything like that. You can't look at somebody and just know that they're gay or trans or anything like that. Also, being gay and trans are different, and sexual orientation is relative to gender identity. So gender identity is always the first part of that equation. How does this person identify? So if it's a man and they primarily date other men, that person is a gay man. If they're a trans gay man or a cis gay man, that person is still a gay man. And I imagine I might get some questions about that. It is okay to ask questions about gender, partners, preferred pronouns, all that good stuff, and it's okay to feel awkward and make mistakes as you learn how to ask those questions in an appropriate way. And further, there are no universals. Some LGBT people don't even like the term LGBT. They send me angry emails every week about that specific issue. And so don't just assume that because somebody is LGBT that they're going to like all those terms that we had discussed before. Really listen to them and repeat things back to them the way that they identify. Next slide. So let's go ahead and get into some types of the discrimination and some of the legal aspects here in our last half of this presentation. Transgender discrimination. Trans people face a lot of the same types of discrimination that lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks face, but with a number of additional hurdles, which include but are not limited to, for instance, government identity documents that do not reflect their gender and are prohibitively difficult to change. So, for instance, within the state of Iowa, if you want to change your Iowa driver's license, you first have to change your birth certificate. And, there is a process to go through to do that. You have to get signed off on by 2 different physicians or psychiatrists saying that you have irreversibly, that's the word I was looking for, irreversibly changed your gender. You normally need to get a lawyer and pay a little bit of money and go through a process there, but it is possible to do. And so as soon as you've changed your birth certificate, you would then be able to get an Iowa driver's license that matches your gender. As of right now, and I don't know if the new regulations have come out, but as of my current understanding, if you were to come from a state such as Ohio, which did not allow changes to the birth certificate, so states like Ohio and Tennessee, et cetera, actually don't allow people to change their birth certificate at all. Currently, I don't believe you could get an Iowa driver's license that matches your gender. Now, I know that there may be some changes to that here coming up in the near future, but as of today, I have not seen those changes, and so I believe that's where we currently stand. In a number of other states, it's the same way. You have to change that birth certificate. If there's no mechanism to do so, you can't get a driver's license that correctly reflects your gender. Sex-segregated restrooms and other public facilities, obviously there's a big debate going on across the country in regards to this. I will say that in Iowa, transgender people have been allowed to use restrooms, shower facilities, etc., that match their gender identity since 2007. So for the last 9 years, this policy has been in place, this seemingly contentious policy, and we have not had any incidents to that effect at all. So for the better part of a decade, none of the things that have been said about this community have happened. And so we are very skeptical that there would be any negative impact from continuing this policy or from implementing it nationwide in the school systems as is being required by Title IX. You can be fired for being trans in 31 states. We'll go over that here in a minute. And then there are barriers to access appropriate health care, as I had talked about a little bit earlier, blanket bans in Iowa State Medicaid, for instance, all sorts of other barriers erected to prevent trans people from getting access to the care that they need. Some quick snapshots. So as I had said before, 41% can't change the gender marker on their IDs or on one ID for whatever reason. 57% have experienced family rejection. 19% have experienced homelessness, normally as a function of that family rejection. 19% outright refused medical care because of their gender identity. And 47%, almost 1 in 2 trans people will attempt suicide at some point in their life. Almost 1 in 3 will die from suicide at some point in their life. The thing about this statistic is, and I always try to caution people around this, this is not intrinsic to being a transgender person. This is not intrinsic to having a gender identity that doesn't match the sex that you were assigned at birth. When we put transgender people into situations where they're not constantly being discriminated against, where they have access to resources, where they have support networks, where they have friends and family members that accept them, and church communities, et cetera, all of the things that some of the rest of us take for granted, then those rates drop down and get a lot closer to the general population rates. And so this is not a function of being transgender. This is a function of being constantly discriminated against, and this is something that we could fix if we so put our minds to doing so. Can people answer questions? Is that a thing that we can open up?
Only if we built it in beforehand.
Okay, never mind that. So I'll just ask you to look at this list and think in your mind, do you know whether or not you can be fired for being LGBT in the state of Iowa? Do you know about Nebraska? What would be your answer for Missouri? What would be your answer for Wisconsin? What would be your answer for Illinois? You can't be fired for being LGBT in the state of Iowa. You can be fired for being LGBT in the state of Nebraska and the state of Missouri unless in Missouri, you work for the executive branch of the state government. In Wisconsin, you can be fired for being trans, but not for being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And in Illinois, you can't be fired for any of those things. So kind of think, if you're an LGBT person, how will your rights change depending on what state you're traveling through, depending on where you go to work, depending on where you decide to live? What is that going to look like? It's an incredible patchwork, and it can be a very daunting task. So here's kind of the map from the ACLU of statewide employment non-discrimination policies. You'll see this dark purple color, which Iowa is a part of, has comprehensive non-discrimination policies for LGBT people. If you look at Wisconsin, that slightly lighter color, and New York and a couple of other states, you will find that they have protections for the lesbian, gay, and bisexual community, but not for the transgender community. And then all of those other states do not have any sort of employment protections. You can be fired for being LGBT in any of those states. A number of them also lack protections in other areas too. So for instance, public accommodation. You could be denied access to a hotel room. You could be denied public transportation, denied non-emergency medical care, denied a whole slew of other things just because of your gender identity or your sexual orientation. So discrimination is real. It is legally sanctioned in a number of states. In 28 states, legal to fire somebody for their sexual orientation. 31 states, legal to fire somebody for their gender identity. National efforts to prevent that kind of discrimination have been stalled in Congress for years, since the 80s. ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, has died and has now been replaced by the Equality Act, which is a more comprehensive piece of legislation. But its chances for passing are pretty much identical. There is no movement on that whatsoever. There are some limited protections for folks federally through Title VII and Title IX, but we don't know exactly what those mean yet, and the courts have not vetted them, so we don't know exactly where that's going. However, not in Iowa. So since the Iowa Civil Rights Code was amended in 2007, 100% of our population is protected against discrimination based on sexual orientation. 100% of our population is protected from discrimination based on gender identity, that's not just in the areas of employment, but it's also in the areas of public accommodation, credit practices, education, and housing is the other one as well. So we do have comprehensive anti-discrimination protections in this state. So how do you design non-discrimination policies in your workplace? That's the next thing that I'm going to talk about in the small amount of time that I have left. And I will say that this is easier than I think a lot of folks think it would be. Some reasons to adopt such policies: it does maximize recruitment and retention of trained folks by not caring what some arbitrary metric like gender identity or sexual orientation is going to impact that, because it won't. It creates an environment of fairness and increases morale, and it also improves employee productivity. So LGBT employees can focus on their work rather than worrying about their gender transition or gossip about their relationships, and non-LGBT employees can focus on work and not controversy. So it really does benefit the workplace all around by having these policies. Some situations that do need solutions: restrooms, harassment and hostile work environment, male-female boxes on forms or ID cards, background credit checks, security checks, whatever that might look like. Those can enter some snags when we have a transgender employee and we don't have policies that address that. Gender-specific housing, if you have housing in your place of employment or your educational facility, whatever we might be talking about, showers, locker rooms, all that stuff, and then dress codes as well. And I'm not going to go through these point by point because I simply don't have time to do that, but those are situations that you will need to look at. 3 principles in any situation that you are designing to recognize. So first is recognizing self-identity regardless of surgery, documentation, etc. So asking yourself, is this person's gender identity and expression being recognized in this situation appropriately, or am I asking them to verify that in some way that I wouldn't ask somebody else? So do I ask my cisgender female employees to give me a copy of their birth certificate before using the restroom? No, I don't. And so why am I doing that for my transgender employees? That doesn't seem fair. Understanding and applying the concept of reasonable accommodation. So asking yourself, is this a situation where the typical policies or procedures are resulting in an LGBT person having to unfairly endure difficult or different conditions at work because of their gender identity or sexual orientation? The third one, and I think maybe the most important one, because I do think there's a little confusion around this, biases of customers or coworkers are not a valid or legally admissible reason for discrimination. So asking yourself, is this a situation where an entity is trying to accommodate the biases or lack of comfort with LGBT people, their customers, or others? Just because your customer does not like LGBT people does not mean that you are allowed to then discriminate against your LGBT customers or employees in order to keep their business. Anti-discrimination still works even if the customer is the person being discriminatory, and that has to be addressed appropriately. So some quick suggestions, and then I'll move into question time. So changing your language. Rather than asking somebody about their husband or their wife, asking about their partner and allowing them to identify who that person is. Rather than, asking a young person if they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, asking if they have a partner or a significant other. Removing gender binaries on forms, I think that's huge. Do not just have a male or a female checkbox on any sort of form that you have. At least have a third option there, whether that is, a blank or a transgender or non-binary or whatever you think your clientele will feel most comfortable with. You should at least have another option there for folks who may not be comfortable checking either of those boxes. Mirroring language people use for themselves and their partners, that's, business sales 101. They're going to tell you, if you go into a business sales class, that the quickest way to build rapport with anybody is to mirror the language that they're using for themselves right back to them. That's just a good strategy all around, not just with the LGBT community, but for everybody. And then refraining from asking invasive questions about people's bodies. I already talked about that in depth, so I won't go over it again. Showing your openness, wearing and posting LGBT inclusive stickers and pins is a very good thing. We do, at One Iowa, actually have a designation program, our Safe Zone designation, and if you folks are interested in that, please visit our website. It's a 6-hour comprehensive training that allows you also a designation through our organization as well. You get a sticker, you get a pin, all that good stuff, and you get all the information that you could possibly want about the LGBT community, along with 2 years of ongoing support. And then assuring confidentiality and making coming out safe. The worst thing that you could possibly do to somebody is out them against their will. In certain cases, it can be absolutely deadly. So please do not do that under any circumstances. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions.
With the gender identity portion, we did something differently this year for one of the programs that I managed. When they fill out their personal information, we don't ask them to circle male or female. We just have he, his, him, and she, hers, her, and we ask, how do you prefer to be referred to? And then we had an other where they could write it in because the other category is very large.
Absolutely.
So, but that came about after having a student that identified differently than what we were used to.
Yeah.
And it was one of those moments even for me that I was like, oh, wow, we haven't done this yet.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to do it, too, because then you get the pronouns as well. Just because somebody might check a certain box doesn't necessarily mean that that's how they want to be referred to. Then that brings me to another strategy, actually. When I introduce myself to folks who, may have different gender identities or who may be ambiguous or anything like that, and in certain situations, just universally, I will do this. Rather than asking them for their pronouns first, I will introduce myself and specify my pronouns. So something like, oh, hey, my name's Keenan. I go by he, him, his. What's your name? And then that gives them the opportunity to not only give you their name, but also their pronouns as well without kind of putting them on the spot. I think that's a really good strategy to use.
We did have a question about the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint and the recording will be made available after this. It will be on DesMoinesMetro.com, and we have a workforce inclusion tab that all of our webinars are historically placed under. If you really like hearing him talk, we have another one out there that he facilitated for us about a year and a half ago that I believe pertained to the transgender.
So it was transgender specific. So some of the information is the same. The definitions are obviously the same because those didn't change. But if you remember that list before that we went over, the restrooms, all that stuff, if you want an in-depth explanation of how to design those policies, definitely check that out.
So with the term LGBT, we sometimes have the Q tacked onto the end.
Yeah.
It could either mean queer or questioning, but there are some popular celebrities right now, like Leah Delaria from Orange is the New Black, that's really pushing for a blanket usage of queer.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any more movement in the languages, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we get the Q question a lot, and sometimes we'll even be 2 Qs just to make sure that we get both queer and questioning in there. And what we normally do as an organization is we recognize that there's actually a generational split around this particular language. And so for any of our materials for folks over 30, we actually don't use the Q. And for folks under 30, we do. So the reason is that for older folks, a lot of them have told us this, view that term as a slur. And that's the only time it's been used to refer to them is, in a moment of violence or in a moment of terror. And so that's the association they have with that word, and it's a really difficult word for them to hear, and especially a difficult word for them to attach as an identity label at some level. But for young people really do like that postmodern aspect to it, which you were saying, that it is an umbrella term, and that if you tell somebody that you're queer, you haven't really told them a whole lot, that you're not like kind of giving away the whole game in identifying that way. You're not telling them what your gender is. You're not really telling them who you're attracted to or anything like that. You're maybe telling them that you're not, a straight cis person in that moment, but that's about all you're telling them. And so that can be a very powerful way to identify. There are other terms out there that kind of accomplish the same thing. So I know GSD is kind of gaining popularity, and that stands for gender and sexual diversity. And you'll see that more and more with younger people. That said, LGBT is kind of the umbrella term at this point as far as, AP standard and stuff like that. And so that's the one that we continue to use because it is the most widely recognized at the moment. But if another one came up as more widely recognized, I'm sure we would shift to that.
We have a question that just popped in. It says, what would be the best way to gather biological information in a hospital setting on a form? Some procedures or medications can have different reactions with hormones, et cetera. Great questions.
Yeah, no, that is a wonderful question. If you folks want one of our recommended intake forms, and we have a few from a few different medical providers around this, we can certainly send those to you. I think it might be hard for me to actually describe what it looks like, but oftentimes what you'll have are 2 areas for something like, sex assigned at birth and then gender identity. So you have a difference where you can kind of solicit that information without being inappropriate. And I have tons of examples of how to do that. Different people will do it in different ways, but basically you're going to make a split. You're going to ask somebody to identify both their biological sex and their current gender, and ask in what appreciable ways that has changed. The other thing is, if you need specific information about somebody's specific biological component, that might not be able to be on a form. That might be a discussion to have in the room at the time that you need to ask the question. So it really depends. Please shoot me an email, and I can get a hold of a form for you, an example form, and kind of game that out with you as to what your needs are and what would work best. My email address will be at the end of this, and I'm sure Nathan can get it to you as well. But it's just keenan@oneiowa.org.
Another question just popped in. Perfect timing. Just
great.
a thank you. We like thank yous. That's great as well. Well, we are at just about time. We will have this again saved out there historically. If you do have ideas of topics that you want for future sessions, I'm always open to hearing those. I do not have a commitment that we're doing one of these a month. I do them as I see a need. So when businesses or individuals approach me and say, hey, we're seeing a lot of this topic, can you help us out? I can more than likely gather the resources with the assistance of my inclusion council. And we're always happy to provide these free of charge to our members and to our community. And you could always reach me. My name again is Nathan Ritz. I work for the Greater Des Moines Partnership. And it is N as in Nathan, Ritz, R-I-T-Z, just like the cracker, at DesMoinesMetro.com.
And then there's my email on the slide if you folks still have the PowerPoint up. There it is.
So at this time, I will stop the recording, but we'll remain here for a couple of moments just in case if somebody is still typing a question. Thank you for spending your lunch with us, and have a great rest of your week.